Coming up next, an Astronomy.fm original program. It's time for York Universe, a co-production of the Observatory of York University, Toronto, and the Voice of Astronomy. AFM Radio, AFM Radio, AFM Radio, AFM Radio.
Hello and welcome to York Universe, the astronomy and astrophysics program written and presented by the students, faculty, alumni, and friends of York University. I'm Sana, I'll be one of your hosts this evening, and I'm joined by Shatish.
Hi everyone.
And Connor.
Hello.
We are broadcasting live from the Alan I. Carswell Observatory located at York University in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. Our broadcast is powered by and in partnership with Astronomy.fm, the voice of astronomy. This is Astronomy Night in Canada, where the lineup is all Canadian, starting with ourselves, York Universe, then on to Western World, Quirks and Quarks, and Science for the People. York Universe broadcasts every Monday night at 9 p.m. local Toronto time or Tuesday morning at 2 a.m. Universal time. The York Universe production works in concert with our online public viewing program run by the Observatory team, which runs between the hours of 9 to 10 p.m. local Toronto time. Visit observatory.info.yorku.ca and follow the links or head over to our YouTube page, York U Observatory, to join the chat. We will be monitoring the OPV chat room for questions and showing some hopefully live images from the 1-meter telescope. I am not too sure if the weather is cooperating right now. I know they were calling for rain earlier, so I'm not too sure if they're going to be doing live imaging tonight. But if you have any questions or comments, or if you have questions or comments on our past shows or suggestions for future topics, please send us an email at observe@yorku.ca. You can always connect with us on Twitter or Instagram with the handle @York Observatory and Facebook at Alan I. Carswell Obs. So before we get going on our show tonight, which is filled with a bunch of really interesting material, how are you both doing?
Pretty good, I think. The semester's just started, so transitioning out of summer mode back into school mode.
Yeah, I had to take summer courses this term, but I had a couple weeks off in between the end of that and the start of this term. And I find that especially with school being online now, it doesn't really feel like I'm back to school. So yeah, I'm having some trouble getting back into the swing of things.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that.
Yeah. How about you, Shatish?
I didn't take any summer courses and I am not currently back to school because I'm not. But it's been a while since I've been active online as well. So it feels good to be back.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm definitely excited for this year. And hopefully we can get back to school in the winter term if everything cooperates with COVID, but fingers crossed.
Exactly. I'm actually looking forward to be able to walk into the observatory without any restrictions. I'm hoping it happens soon. I mean, of course, I've not been there for a while, but yeah.
Yeah, I'm heading down to campus for a bit tomorrow, but it's not really for observatory-related stuff. It's been way too long since I've been observing at the observatory.
You know the feeling. You actually have spent a lot of time in that section of the prime observatory. Anyways, I'll stop talking.
All right. Well, I guess we should get started with our This Week in Space and Astronomy history. I am the first up this time around with the fourth year anniversary of the end of one of my favorite missions, the Cassini mission. Well, the Cassini spacecraft was a Saturn orbiting spacecraft. It was there for 13 years, and the mission ended on September 15th, 2017. Cassini and the ESA's Huygens probe, which was going to land on Saturn's moon Titan, launched together in 1997, spent the next 7 years traveling to Saturn, and then finally reached the system in 2004 and when it was put into orbit. So that became the first man-made object to ever be put into orbit around Saturn. There were, I think, 3 missions that had visited Saturn in the past, but they were just flybys. So this was the first one that was dedicated to studying Saturn and could really do some great in-depth observations of the planet. Well, the Cassini mission and Huygens were both incredibly successful. They led to many groundbreaking discoveries over the years by taking a ton of detailed observations of the Saturn system. These were able to answer questions and ask new questions about Saturn, its moons, and its rings, but it also helped with our understanding of the solar system and how it evolved. So just a couple of highlights about some of the things that Cassini observed. We don't have enough time to talk about everything that it did because it's done so much, but these are just a couple of the really cool or / important ones. So Cassini observed lightning on Saturn, which was the first time that had been done. Cassini observed Saturn's yearly storm, which it's yearly for Saturn. It occurs once every 30 years for us, since it takes 30 Earth years for Saturn to orbit the sun. But Saturn's yearly storm fell within the time that Cassini was in orbit around it, so it was able to observe that storm. It also observed a hexagonal jet stream around Saturn's North Pole and took a ton of observations about its magnetic field, which revolutionized scientists' understanding of that field. It's a very complicated magnetic field, and the way that it interacts with things is pretty insane. It's very complicated. So Cassini did a lot of work in figuring out the dynamics of Saturn's magnetic field. It also took extensive observations of Saturn's rings. Just a couple of the things it did was it detected a new ring, which is called the E ring. It's a very, very diffuse outer ring of Saturn. I believe that's why it took so long to detect it, because it's just too dim and you really can't see it from the ground. And it also investigated how Saturn's moons interacted with its rings. Well, all of that is incredibly interesting and definitely changed scientists' view of Saturn and that system. But I think that I got to say some of the most interesting discoveries from Cassini and Huygens came from the observations that it took of Saturn's moons, specifically Titan and Enceladus. So starting with Enceladus, Cassini revealed that Enceladus has a massive subsurface ocean, which is ejecting water into space. And then that water actually feeds Saturn's E ring. And then in 2005, the Huygens probe was released from Cassini, where it eventually landed on Titan, which became the first probe to land on something in the outer solar system. Observations from Titan and also some from Cassini revealed that Titan is a dynamic world. It has rain, clouds, lakes, and rivers, all made of methane. These observations really revolutionized the way that scientists saw moons of the outer solar system, because it revealed that they were these really dynamic and complicated systems instead of just kind of a rock that orbits Saturn, like maybe our moon is. There's not too much going on ours, but it really showed that, even though these moons are very far away from the sun and they're very cold, they still have, in some cases, they can still have sources of heat. They can still have dynamic weather systems. And one of the things that this did was it sparked hope for life in both Titan and Enceladus, which is something that really hadn't been thought too much about, I don't think, before Cassini-Huygens. So that's honestly why I think that some of the discoveries about Saturn's moons are some of the most interesting of the entire mission. Well, in April of 2017, Cassini was nearing the end of its fuel supply, and some engineers and scientists at NASA kind of raised the question of, what do we do with Cassini once it runs out of fuel? If it doesn't have fuel, there's no way to control it. So do we crash it into Saturn, or do we just leave it to orbit Saturn uncontrolled and run the risk of it basically crashing into one of these moons that might host life? And what they ended up deciding to do was just to not take the risk and crash Cassini into Saturn just before it ran out of fuel supply and could still be controlled. So April 2017 marked the start of its final mission, which is called Cassini's Grand Finale. It was a final 22 orbits, which would bring Cassini in the 2,400 kilometer region between Saturn and its rings, with the final orbit plunging Cassini into Saturn's atmosphere. Now, this was a previously unexplored region because it's pretty risky to send the spacecraft here. There's a bunch of rocks and stuff that come from its rings, which Cassini observations revealed that, there's different rocks of variety of masses in the rings. So you can have some substantial sized rocks that could hypothetically crash into the spacecraft and do some severe damage. So they didn't fly it there before, in part because of that, I believe. But since the mission was coming to an end, we may as well try and get some interesting data in this region. And it turned out to be a really interesting place. Cassini took many observations between the rings, which proved to be very, very useful. And this data is actually still being analyzed today. While it took a lot of really interesting observations in between Saturn and its rings, it also continued to take and transmit data right up until the moment that it crashed into Saturn. And that also provided very useful, because it was a way of observing that had never been done before, because you don't just crash spacecrafts into planets. But yeah, Cassini it was an amazing spacecraft. It took a lot of very useful observations that, again, they're still being used today. And it was an incredible end to an incredible mission on September 15th, 2017. And as Shatish pointed out before the show, there's an interesting coincidence that might not actually be a coincidence. The astronomer that the spacecraft is named after, Giovanni Cassini, died on September 14th, 1712. So just a day before the September 15th when Cassini crashed. So maybe a coincidence, but probably not. Sorry?
I'm just saying that they might have just planned it accordingly.
Yeah, it seems like just too much of a coincidence that there wasn't some degree of planning going on there.
Yeah.
And, it's one of those things where, like, logically, these spacecraft are just, these big chunks of metal, but still very emotional when such a long mission like Cassini or like Opportunity and Spirit, for example, when they die, quote unquote.
Yeah. I was really, really sad when the Cassini mission ended. Ariella always gives me a hard time about it because I was really upset.
I think you're not the only person who was literally upset with the mission ending. And you could literally do an entire show on that mission and still not be done with everything that the mission did. So,
yeah,
thanks to you as well.
Yeah, I watched it was a little show on Netflix about the Cassini mission. I don't remember what it was called, but they were interviewing some of the mission scientists and engineers who had been working on this thing for a very long time. And there were some people who had spent basically their entire careers working on this mission. They were, they started working on it sometimes in graduate school or right after that. And it's like 30 years later. It took the spacecraft 7 years to get to Saturn. So that was 20 years that it spent in space, plus all of the planning and development and everything that went into the spacecraft before it launched. So yeah, there were a lot of people who were really, really sad when this mission ended. But overall, it was incredibly successful. It's got to be one of my favorite space missions. So yeah, it was I guess it's just good that it didn't end up crashing into one of the moons. So this is kind of the best case scenario for it. Yeah. All right, so we should get going to our second This Week in History story. So off to you, Connor.
Yeah, so this is actually a bit of a double feature from me, actually. Starting off with September 17th, 1976. The world was officially introduced to the space shuttle as the first orbiter, OV-101, named Enterprise, officially rolled out of construction. So the Space Shuttle Enterprise is perhaps best known for the substantial public interest in its name. It was actually originally planned to be called Constitution, but a letter-writing campaign by Star Trek fans convinced President Gerald Ford to order NASA to rename the first space shuttle Enterprise. It is perhaps a bit ironic then that Enterprise was actually the only space shuttle that never actually went to space, as it was not, designed to do so. It didn't have engines. It didn't have a functional heat shield, as it was covered in simulated tiles made from polyurethane foam rather than the actual ceramic tiles that were used on the space-worthy shuttles. And the leading edge panels of Enterprise's wings were built out of fiberglass, rather than the more weight-efficient reinforced carbon-carbon tiles used on the other orbiters. In addition, it didn't have any reaction control system that would be able to control the shuttle if it were to be in orbit. So, not really something that you would want to, even send to space, much less with people in it. So you might wonder, if Enterprise didn't actually go to space, what was it used for? Well, it was actually used for atmospheric test flights, which brings us to the second part of this double feature, which was about a year later on September 13th, 1977, which was Enterprise's second free flight. This particular flight was designated Alt 13, or Approach and Landing Test 13. This was the shuttle's second free flight. Free flight here means that the shuttle was gliding under its own power rather than being mounted to the space shuttle aircraft, which was a specially designed Boeing 747 that was used to transport the shuttle across the country, because obviously it cannot really actually fly because it is just a glider. So Alt 13 occurred at an altitude of 13,000 feet, or about 8 kilometers, and lasted for 55 minutes, about 5.5 of which were actually in free flight. So during Alt 13, Enterprise was flown by Joe Engle, who was one of the X-15 pilots, as well as the backup lunar module pilot for Apollo 14 and the original LMP for Apollo 17, before the cancellation of the Apollo program prompted NASA to replace him with Harrison Schmitt. So while he didn't get to go to space on Enterprise, he would eventually fly to space on the shuttle twice, first on STS-2 in 1981 aboard Columbia, and on STS-51I in 1985 aboard Discovery. So Engle was joined on this flight by Richard Truly, who had previously served as Capcom for all of the crewed Skylab missions, as well as the Apollo-Soyuz test project. Truly would also eventually fly to space twice, actually accompanying Engle on STS-2 and commanding STS-8 in 1983 on board Challenger. After returning, he would eventually be appointed the 8th NASA administrator. Now, a fun little fact here about Enterprise is that it was actually considered for retrofitting to make it space-worthy in the aftermath of the Challenger disaster, but NASA ultimately decided to instead construct Endeavour as a replacement shuttle out of spare parts that had originally been intended for Discovery and Atlantis. In addition, it was later used for impact analysis after Columbia broke up on reentry to determine if foam blocks from the external fuel tank could actually damage the leading edge of the orbiter's wings. This analysis, it sort of dented the leading edges, or the leading edges of Enterprise's wings. But as I mentioned earlier, Enterprise's leading edges were actually made out of a slightly more sturdy material than the actual shuttle's wings. So they concluded that if these foam blocks could dent the leading edge of Enterprise, then it almost certainly could have shattered the wings of Columbia, causing it to break up on reentry. So after the space shuttle fleet was retired, Enterprise found itself first at the Smithsonian and later at the Intrepid Museum in New York City, where notably in 2012 it suffered some minor damage after Hurricane Sandy caused the roof over it to collapse onto the orbiter.
I love that, Star Trek fans got the space shuttle renamed.
Yeah, I think officially the president never, said for certain that was why he renamed it. I think his official stance was, he was simply partial to the name Enterprise. But I think, everyone knows that, I think at the time it was one of the largest letter writing campaigns organized in American history. So you can imagine it probably influenced his decision at least a little bit.
That's great. I love that.
Yeah, and actually, when Enterprise was rolled out of its construction bay, it was actually accompanied by the crew of the USS Enterprise, the original series Star Trek crew.
I sometimes wonder, maybe those efforts might have been in the first instance of, I don't know, crowdfunding efforts in the future, because fans actually matter and people matter. So
yeah,
just that could be.
Yeah.
It seems almost inevitable, these days that, whatever our next big spacecraft design is going to be, we're probably going to name it Enterprise. It just seems to be, what just has to happen.
Yeah. I think NASA at least is still letting the public name its like spacecraft. I know like Perseverance and Ingenuity were named by, I think, like maybe grade 8 students.
Yeah, that sounds about right. I mean, it's a pretty good, public outreach program.
Yeah, I mean, you get to say that you were the one, or you helped name some spacecraft. That's pretty cool. Yeah, I wonder if this had anything to do with that. Yeah, okay. Well, we'll move on to the next item, which is back to me, which is September 14th, 1968, the launch of the Zond 5 mission. This mission was part of the Soviets' Zond program, which was meant to do two things. First of all, they were sending some missions to explore the solar system. And the other part of the Zond program was meant to help them prepare for manned landings on the moon. Of course, the Soviets never actually accomplished these manned landings, but at the time they were still planning on doing it. So these missions were used in those preparations. Zond 5 specifically launched from a Proton K rocket from the Baikor Cosmodrome, which is the Soviet spaceport in Kazakhstan. I'm pretty sure I did not pronounce the name of the spaceport correctly, so my apologies. Well, the Zond 5 spacecraft consisted of a modified version of the Soyuz capsule that would have been used for manned flights to the moon had they happened. And this mission was actually intended to carry cosmonauts to the moon. If that had happened, it would have marked the first time that humans had went to the moon. However, the Zond program had suffered several mission failures ahead of Zond 5, so they ended up deciding that it was too risky to make it a manned flight, and decided to just make it an unmanned one so that if it failed, you weren't losing any cosmonauts in the mission. But the mission itself was quite a success. Instead of launching humans on the mission, they ended up using it to study how spaceflight and reentry affect life. To do this, it carried a variety of Earth life on board, which included flies, plants, seeds, bacteria, and 2 turtles. The turtles were chosen so that they could study the effects of spaceflight and reentry on living creatures, and the other things were chosen to study the effects of cosmic radiation. They also put a mannequin equipped with radiation sensors into the pilot seat to help with their radiation tests. Of course, by this point, humans had been going into space for a few years, but no one had ever gone out as far out as the moon. And I believe you get more radiation the further away from Earth you go because you lose some protections. So there was a bit of a question about how much radiation are we going to be exposing astronauts and cosmonauts to when we send them to the moon. And I think this mission was designed to help try and answer that question. Well, after the launch of Zond 5, it headed to the moon. It reached it a few days later on September 18th, where it circled the moon once, having a close approach distance of 1,950 kilometers. Zond 5 then returned to the Earth and splashed down in the Indian Ocean on September 21st, which made it the first successful circumlunar mission, and also the first mission to bring Earth life to the moon. Zond 5 did have a couple other problems with attitude sensors. One of them failed on the way to the moon, and then another one failed on the way back. And I think all of this confusion caused the spacecraft to turn off its guided reentry system, which caused Zond 5 to splash down in the Indian Ocean instead of its intended landing site in Kazakhstan. But still, the mission was a success. Everything was recovered safely. They managed to get a lot of useful observations out of this mission. A couple of the things that it did was it was able to take some very high quality images of the moon and also some high quality images of the Earth at a distance of about 90,000 kilometers. And then in terms of investigating how spaceflight will affect life, they determined that spaceflight did not cause any significant damage to the turtles that they had on board. So overall, a very successful mission on September 14th, 1968.
Imagine just living as a turtle, and then some guy picks you up and sends you to the moon.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that'd be kind of crazy because they don't know what's going on. So any of these animals that get launched into space, it must be crazy. You know, you're in this really new environment. You don't know what's going on. It would really be crazy. I'm repeating myself, but
no, but that point is actually valid because I'm not sure how successful the medical experiments were, But the turtles probably wouldn't have felt much because they wouldn't be able to notice the surroundings any more than, whatever is within their eyesight. So, and I don't even know how intelligent turtles are. But that is really a valid point to consider over and over again. Maybe they can send some other animal the next time. Although it's been a while.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think sometimes it just seems like we bring animals up into these weird environments just to see what they'll do. I think I remember seeing video from NASA, I believe, of them bringing birds up into the 0G plane and just seeing them, try to fly around without gravity.
Which I think they didn't. Can they actually?
They were very confused.
Right.
Yeah, they're just sort of just flapping around and being like, I don't know what's happening.
Yeah. Were they, because I would think that they would have a hard time actually really flying like they normally did, but maybe their wings would allow them to move around a bit in space.
Yeah, I mean,
exactly.
I don't think that was the problem. It just, they can't really orient themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, because I know there's a couple videos of astronauts on the ISS, they'll put themselves away from any walls or stuff, and it's like they can kind of swim through the air, and it takes them a really long time to be able to get close enough to a wall or something to grab onto to be able to control themselves. So maybe those birds didn't have that problem, but yeah.
But they can at least see. I'm sure there's light on the space, like other spacecraft or aboard. But that's pretty much that they get. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it would be really interesting to go into 0Gs, I think. Yeah.
Try a simulator, of course.
Yeah. All right, well, we should probably keep moving on, and I think we are back to Connor.
Yes, so this is September 17th, 1789, going back to Saturn, actually. This was the day that William Herschel discovered Mimas, Saturn's seventh moon. So Herschel made this discovery using his 40-foot telescope, which was the largest in the world at the time. Now, if 40 feet sounds like a very large telescope, this actually refers to the length of the focus rather than the aperture, which is now the convention. These days, we would call it a 1.2 meter telescope, so just a little bit bigger than the 1 meter telescope we have here at York, but something that's very impressive for something that was constructed in the 1780s. So actually, the discovery of Mimas came just a few weeks after Herschel used the same telescope to discover Saturn's sixth moon, Enceladus. Mimas is a notable object for several reasons. First of all, it is extremely small, just shy of 400 kilometers in diameter. This makes it the smallest known gravitationally rounded object in the solar system. In addition, it is primarily made of ice rather than rock. Now, this is curious because it is closer to Saturn than Enceladus is, and it has a more elliptical orbit than Enceladus. So it experiences a greater tidal force than Enceladus. However, it lacks the liquid water geysers that are driven by internal heat that Enceladus has. Consequently, any theories about Enceladus's geysers, what they are, how they're formed, what causes them, must also be able to explain why, despite all of these things, Mimas is frozen solid, while Enceladus appears to have, some kind of liquid ocean. Mimas's most notable surface feature is a massive crater that is named after Herschel. It has a diameter about a third that of the moon itself. I believe a crater of the same, relative scale here on Earth would be larger than Australia. So this is in, a very large crater relative to the size of the moon. You might imagine, the impact event that created this crater was, likely extremely violent. And, the chaotic terrain that is located exactly opposite the crater, on the other side of Mimas, suggests that the impact forces ripped through the moon, nearly tearing it apart. And another little fun fact from me here is that such a large crater on a small round moon actually makes Mimas resemble the Death Star from Star Wars. So this is apparently entirely coincidental.
Yeah, I can't imagine being the first people to look at the pictures of Enceladus and see it looking like the Death Star. Because, sorry, go ahead.
I was just saying, I think it's a coincidence because from what I read, it sounded like we didn't actually have, high resolutions of Mimas until after Star Wars was released. So, it's not like Mimas inspired the design of the Death Star or anything like that.
Yeah, definitely a coincidence, but it would have been funny to be looking at that and seeing the Death Star.
Most definitely.
Yeah. Well, we are at 9:30, so we're running a little behind here, and I guess we should move on to Satish.
Well, sure. So I have a little, like small piece for both the shout out for one of the most famous physicists of all time, as far as astronomy is concerned. So September 11th, 1877. This is a birthday shout out for James Jeans. He was an English physicist, an astronomer, and a mathematician, which probably goes. He was a gifted mathematician as a child. He was a fellow of the Trinity College, and then he moved on to teach at Cambridge and then taught applied mathematics at Princeton, and then came back to Cambridge in 1910. So he's well known for his contribution to quantum theory, radiation, as well as stellar evolution. And with, along with Arthur Eddington, who was another British physicist, as far as I remember, he is well regarded as the founder of British cosmology, or you could even say modern cosmology in some circles. And then they were both together, they were both the first to conjecture the model of steady state cosmology, which was based on the idea that matter is continuously created in the universe, which is not what the Big Bang model proposes. And then, of course, this fell out of favor later on when people discovered and started studying the cosmic microwave background. But apart from that, he wrote monographs on, theoretical mechanics, theory of gases, specifically dynamic theory of gases, and also a book on the mathematical theory of electricity and magnetism, which are considered major contributions to science literature. And he wrote a number of books on revolutionary discoveries during his day for the normal people, basically. And last but not the least, to use the cliche here, the elite hall of physicists would recognize him as the person responsible for a phenomenon called the Jeans length and the Rayleigh-Jeans law, which most of us physics students have studied at some point in time. So happy birthday, James Jeans.
Yeah, I'll never not be impressed by the massive volume of work that these early physicists and astronomers do. It seems like basically all of the important things were done by like a group of maybe 10 people.
Yeah, in so many different fields too. I mean, now it's kind of like you specialize in one thing, but it used to be that one person would do a little bit of something in one area and some work in another. And
well, so the funny thing is to actually spell out a lie, which actually is a lie, but they sort of had it easy in the sense that they could run around in the entire field anywhere and then come back with whatever was unique. And today, there's already so much already done that all you can really do is specialize until you find something really, really unique where there's nothing to find out anymore.
That's true. All right, so that concludes our This Week in Astronomy History. So for those of you just tuning in, you're listening to York Universe, broadcasting live from the Alan I. Carswell Observatory at York University in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. You're listening to Satish, Connor, and myself, Sana, currently discussing some astronomy history. Go to observatory.info.yorku.ca to join the online public viewing chat room and to ask us any questions you may have and to see some images taken by our observatory team. You can also connect with us on Twitter or Instagram with the handle @YorkObservatory and on Facebook at Alan I. Carswell Obs. So we have several interesting news stories coming up for everybody tonight, but before we get to that, we do have a couple of reminders. So the reminder that I have two observing reminders is that if there's anybody who's interested in observing the International Space Station, it's doing a nice visible pass on the 19th at around 8:15 p.m. over Toronto. This isn't going to be exactly the same timing for everyone, so make sure that you check NASA's Spot the Station or Heavens Above to find the exact time. So just enter your location and it'll tell you when it's coming overhead. For anyone that's ever observed the ISS, it's a very easy thing to observe. You can even observe it in Toronto where you can't get many other deep sky objects. It just looks like a very bright star that's moving really quickly overhead. So definitely a very fun thing to observe. And also if you're looking to observe at night or just like in the evening, the Moon, Jupiter, and Saturn will all be in the southeast sky about an hour after sunset. So you don't have to stay up too late to be able to get a good look at the three of them. They start getting pretty close to each other on the 15th, and they actually form a little triangle in the sky on the night of the 17th. So you don't have to stay up too late to get a good look at some things this week. Right. I don't think we have any other reminders unless you guys can think of something.
None for me.
None? Okay. All right, so we'll move on to our news items where I'm coming up first here. So this is yet another little update on Perseverance and Ingenuity. The two landed on Mars in February, and I feel like I've been talking about them a lot ever since then, but they've been up to a lot of things and doing a lot of great work. So here's another update on them. The first update I have is that Perseverance has now collected its first 2 Martian rock samples. This is with one of the mission objectives of the Perseverance mission was to collect some rock samples, which will later be returned to Earth as part of the Mars Sample Return Campaign, which is a campaign run by NASA and the European Space Agency. Well, the first step in this campaign was accomplished over the past couple of weeks when Perseverance used its sampling and catching system, which is actually the most complex mechanism that's ever been launched into space, to collect 2 samples from a rock that scientists have nicknamed Rochette. The first rock collection began on September 1st and was then sealed a few days later on the 6th after mission scientists confirmed that the sample was successfully collected. A few days later, on September 8th, the team then announced that the rover had successfully collected its second sample from the same rock. They ended up collecting 2 samples from the same rock because mission scientists thought that it was a very interesting rock, and they wanted to make sure they had a good sample of it when it was returned to the Earth. It seemed to be a very interesting target for a couple reasons. First of all, the rock is on a ridgeline in Jezero Crater, which is called Artubi, and it's believed to have some of the crater's deepest and oldest exposed bedrock, which gives scientists a good look very far back into Martian evolution. This is also a prime spot to look for evidence of past life because Jezero Crater is believed to be an ancient lake. So the rover, one of the things that this mission has wanted to accomplish is looking for evidence of past microbial life on Mars, and you want to look where there was water. Well, the rover's instruments have performed some initial analysis on the rock samples already, which reveals that Rochette is a young rock that's likely a basalt rock, meaning that it could have formed from cooled lava. There was also some salt detected in the samples, which could have come from groundwater. Well, the 2 samples are now stored in Perseverance's interior in sealed titanium sample tubes, which should be collected during a series of missions over the next 10 years. They're expected to return to Earth sometime in the 2030s. There are 43 sample tubes available in total, which when returned to the Earth will be analyzed using some of the most sophisticated equipment that's available and will hopefully be used to answer some major questions about Mars, including the things that I've mentioned so far, like possible microbial life on the planet in the past and Mars's evolution. Perseverance is now traveling towards the South Setia region of Jezero Crater, which has a very interesting ridgeline for the rover to explore, and it might actually pick up a few more samples when it's on its way there, possibly up to 8 samples or by the time it reaches there, it will have possibly filled up 8 of its 43 sample tubes. So definitely a very interesting area on Mars to be exploring. Well, Perseverance's companion, the helicopter Ingenuity, has also had lots of success lately, and it completed its 13th flight on September 4th. Keep in mind that Ingenuity was only actually supposed to fly 4 times as part of a technology demonstration, but Ingenuity survived all of those flights, so NASA decided to keep flying it. They did this in part because this is the first thing to have ever flown on Mars, and they still have a lot to learn about how flight on Mars works. So they can get a lot of very good engineering data to learn how to construct next generation Mars helicopters. But another perk of flying Ingenuity is that it provides something that can scout future destinations for Perseverance to visit before it goes there. It's been pretty helpful with scouting future Perseverance destinations. Its observations have helped to rule out a location that seemed really interesting from satellite observations, but when they got a closer look at it using Ingenuity, they decided that it wasn't really that interesting and they should go somewhere else. And in some of its recent flights, including the 12th and 13th flights, it's been used to scout the South Setia region ahead of Perseverance's journey there. Its last flight in particular took it only 8 meters above the surface for 161 seconds, where it traveled at 3.3 meters per second. This was lower and slower than it had been traveling in most of its other flights, but it was meant to get a very in-depth look at the region and also look at it using some different angles than it had observed during its 12th flight. So Perseverance and Ingenuity are both doing very well, and looks like we'll hopefully be having a lot of very interesting updates about the pair coming up.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, coming up here at the beginning of October, we're going to have some time off from Mars News, as all of our Mars missions are going to be going radio silent for about 3 weeks as Mars passes behind the sun. So obviously we can't actually communicate with them rather, while that is the case. Sometime.
Sorry?
I'm just saying, so, we're getting about, 3 weeks in October where, no Mars news, unfortunately.
Yeah, I know that when they had extended the Ingenuity's flights, I think they were planning on actually not using it after this period of radio silence. Like they're going to fly it up until sometime in October and then stop. But I'm not sure if I believe that. They still have a functioning helicopter on Mars if it's given it survives any future flights. So I don't really see them not flying it if it's still working. I really love the Ingenuity helicopter. It's incredibly interesting. So I hope they keep flying it.
Yeah, I mean, as long as it works, like if you've got a functioning helicopter on Mars, why would you not use it?
Yeah, I feel like maybe they don't give people too many expectations on how much it's going to be used, just so that if it does crash, they don't have to explain, like, it's not as bad if they had promised all of these great things from the helicopter. So maybe that's why they're saying that they're not going to use it anymore. But again, I don't believe that.
Yeah, I mean, historically, it does seem to be the case. All these missions are like, oh, it's going to, last 3 months. It lasts like 15 years.
Yeah, I mean, look at Hubble. It's over 30 years old now.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Well, speaking of Hubble, Connor has some news about Hubble's replacement.
Yes, this is a bit of a shorter news item, I would say, but also a very exciting one. Last week, NASA and ESA announced that the launch date for the James Webb Space Telescope has been reset to December 18th, 2021. So yes, it seems like after many, many years of delays, and keep in mind this thing was originally meant to launch in 2007, I believe. The James Webb Space Telescope is actually going to launch before the end of this year. All the final reviews have been completed. The launch vehicle is being assembled, and the telescope itself will be shipped out to French Guiana by the end of this month. Now, this is, I think, the closest we have ever been to, the supposed launch day. So, I'm thinking, this time it might actually happen. So JWST is going to be launched on December 18th on board an Ariane 5 rocket, which will finally bring the 24-year-long design, construction, and testing phase to an end. Notably, the Ariane 5 has an exceptional safety record, with the last payload loss occurring in 2002, following a first stage engine failure. I believe after that they had an uninterrupted, successful launch. I think almost 80 of them in a row until I think 2017 when there was a partial failure of a rocket, but the satellite was still able to get to its orbit. So, one of the safest rockets that currently exists, launching probably one of the most highly anticipated and also extremely expensive spacecraft in recent years.
Yeah. I read that initially James Webb was only supposed to cost something like less than $1 billion, and now it's up to nearly 10 billion. So definitely one of the most expensive missions.
Yeah, being delivered 15 years late and about 20 times over budget. Hopefully it's worth it.
Oh, it better be. If it succeeds, it definitely will be worth it. Mm-hmm. I'm going to be working with some of the JWST data, and I've been reading a lot of papers, and in pretty much every paper that I read that's talking about like high redshift universe stuff, it basically just says, it'll say like, we can do some analysis with the data that we do have, but to draw any more conclusions, we need James Webb data. Every single paper that I've read about the high redshift universe has said that. So it's definitely going to pay off if it launches and if nothing goes wrong.
Yeah, I'll also note that, even though it keeps being billed as, Hubble's replacement, it's not really, because Hubble operates primarily in visual, while James Webb is an infrared telescope. So, it's not like they're going to retire Hubble once James Webb is up and operational. But, it's always good to, have a backup, up there.
Yeah. I heard that James Webb was actually, or the concept of James Webb was being discussed before Hubble had even launched. It was like always set to be some kind of replacement for Hubble, but then it just ended up lasting for so long. And it's the same thing with Ingenuity. If NASA has a working telescope in orbit, they're not just going to stop using it.
Yeah.
But then have they even officially mentioned that they would decommission or take back Hubble in any sense? Because I didn't follow that part.
I don't think it has an official decommissioning date, other than just sort of nebulously at some point it's going to have some sort of technical failure and we don't have a space shuttle anymore to service it.
So now that we have the James Webb, we're hoping that the Hubble would fail. I'm just trying to crack a joke somewhere here, but
yeah, there's no like you said, Connor. There's no specific date for Hubble decommissioning, but it's over 30 years old now, and it's starting to have a lot of problems. I think it was 1 or 2 months ago it had some major problems with one of the computers, and it was out of service for a couple weeks while they were shooting it. So yeah, the thing is just getting old. It's having more issues, and it is 30 years old. So it's going to be essentially dying on its own at some point within probably the next few years, which is really sad, but not entirely unexpected.
That's going to be a first Death Star, maybe. Of course, it wouldn't explode or even implode.
I think when Hubble eventually does stop working, I'm going to be sadder about that than I was Cassini, because it's such an amazing telescope.
You need to choose sides. Finally, you need to decide.
I have 5 different favorite missions because they're all just great. You can't say that one of them is superior. I mean, one of them's a telescope, one of them's a Saturn orbiter, there are some on Mars. The missions are just all amazing.
I know, seriously. And the amount of time that goes into any of them, like literally one generation grows up to become the next set of astronomers or space scientists. That's phenomenal in itself. So yeah, you can't take sides.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very, very exciting with James Webb. And hopefully the launch does actually proceed on December 18th. I have it marked on my calendar. I'm so excited for it. But I can't help shake the feeling that like something else is going to happen and it's not going to launch. But fingers crossed that it does. It's looking like it's finally going to this time. All right, well, we have our final news item from Shatish.
Well, sure. So I'm hoping this is not really, a news for any of us anymore. But let's talk about the SpaceX Inspiration 4 launch. That's supposed to happen in a couple of days from now. This is intended as the first orbital spaceflight with only civilians, or as some news people would say, private citizens aboard. I'm not sure what that actually is supposed to mean, but it will not be astronauts, professional ones. So the mission is hoping to raise money for the St. Jude Research Hospital for Children. And the 4 civilians, maybe that's the reason they've called it Inspiration 4, or it's because of the CEO himself. But so the 4 civilians are Jared Isaacman, who is the CEO for Shift 4 Payments. And there is Haley Arsenault, Christopher Simbrowski, and Sean Proctor. So they will all spend 3 days in orbit aboard the Crew Dragon Resilience, which is actually fitted with the cupola. I'll come back to that later. And after the liftoff from the Kennedy Space Center's Launch Complex 39A, excuse me, atop a 2-timer Falcon 9 Block 5 launch vehicle, and the rocket itself is known as B1062. That's the best naming convention I've come across. They will not, of course, mind you, will not be paying any attention to the International Space Station because they will only be orbiting, sub or whatever that thing is. So they are expected to splash back off the coast of Florida. And while aboard, they will perform a variety of medical experiments and record health data to support future human space flights. The crew also plans to carry a few items to be auctioned later, which probably is part of their fundraising efforts. So that would include jackets made by patients at the St. Jude's. They will also be carrying a Fisher Apollo 11 50th anniversary space pen, and probably a coin set is also in the mix somewhere there. There would also be a ukulele from Martin Guitar to be played by Chris Simbrowski in space. And then Arsenault will play a non-fungible token by the band which goes by the name Kings of Leon during the flight. The track itself, which has never been released till now, is called Time in Disguise. Apart from that, beer enthusiasts can look forward to some truly out-of-the-world beer, as the crew will carry 66 pounds of hop. Although I'm not sure how much beer it will actually create, but it would be later brewed by the people at Samuel Adams, and they have committed to donate a maximum of $100,000 to St. Jude's, and the proceeds will come from the Inspiration 4 official beer. So the crew also plans to carry a few plastic and plush STEM toys based on the 5 characters from Space Racers, which is the animated STEM series, which some of us will be aware of. The SpaceX people did a test fire of the Falcon 9 rocket yesterday, and they expect to follow an approximately 5-hour launch window, which I think will start at around 8 o'clock Eastern time on Tuesday. That's tomorrow. The spacecraft will be launched into a low Earth orbit with an apogee of 590 kilometers and at an inclination of 51.6 degrees. So those are some specific details. The spacecraft's docking adapter, which I just talked about, the cupola module. So which is usually, the docking adapter is usually used to dock with the ISS, but in this case, it's been replaced by the mission by a single monolithic domed glass window, and that would allow a 360-degree view outside the Resilience's nose itself. So that would be the largest single-piece window ever flown to space. It is protected during the launch and re-entry by the spacecraft's retractable nose cone, and it will house a custom camera enabling photography of the vehicle's interior and exterior during the flight. And apart from that, a few details about the CEO as well as the other crew members. So the CEO, Jared Isaacman, he's an experienced pilot with qualification in multiple military jets. That's interesting. Who will also board the flight representing the value of leadership. Isaacman procured the flight and its 4 seats from SpaceX and donated 2 of the seats to St. Jude. And Haley Arsenault, a physician's assistant at the hospital, and herself being a survivor of bone cancer, was selected by the hospital to board the flight representing the value of hope. St. Jude actually raffled the second seat in a fundraiser aimed at raising $200 million, US dollars, for the hospital. And an undisclosed person, that's the interesting part, from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, ultimately won the raffle, but decided to give the seat to his friends, one friend, who is a U.S. Air Force veteran, Christopher Sembrowski, who actually had also participated in the raffle. So he will also board the flight, represent the value of generosity, and entrepreneur Sean Proctor, I don't know how to pronounce the name. He was selected by Shift4 Payments to board the flight representing the value of prosperity through a competition modeled after the Shark Tank that rewarded the best business idea to make use of Shift4's commerce solutions. And that's pretty much that we could probably want to talk about this mission for now. And we can look forward to its success in the next coming week.
Yeah, I know that a lot of private companies have been doing their own launches now, but I think that this has got to be my favorite one of the 3 that have launched. This is really interesting. I knew that they were going to space, but I didn't really know much about it. But I love a lot of parts of this mission. It's great that they're doing this for charity, and the people that they selected to go on it and everything. That's really great. It looks like there's going to be some really interesting science coming out of this also.
Yeah, I mean, since we're already on the roll with every single billionaire trying to launch themselves, this seems more humble. And then they're also planning, like Netflix is also planning a 5-episode series, which will be entitled Countdown, which will cover this entire mission. And for people who probably will be thinking if they're even qualified, like the people on board, they actually have received official training as an astronaut by SpaceX.
Wow. It's interesting also that Elon Musk isn't going on this flight. Like, he's sending other people. So
that's the most interesting part, trust me.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I'm definitely looking forward to this now. I'd heard about it and didn't really pay that much attention to it because I just thought, oh, it's another billionaire launching themselves into space. But no, I'm excited for this now.
Cheers.
Yeah. All right. Well, it seems that we are at the end of our show with less than a minute left. So we'll head on out now. So you've been listening to York Universe, the astronomy and astrophysics program written and presented by the students, faculty, alumni, and friends of York University. The hosts this evening have been Shatish, Connor, and myself, Sana. Stay tuned because it's Astronomy Night in Canada. Coming up next is Western Worlds, Quirks and Quarks, and Science for the People. You can always connect with us on Twitter at the handle @YorkUniverse and check out our website for show notes, content, updates, and contact info at observatory.info.yorku.ca. Thanks for tuning in, clear skies, and have a good night.
Please contact
Good night.
You can find more of our AFM original programs on our website. It's really easy to find us. We are astronomy.fm.